Hey everybody, Greg Lewis, Orange Frog Photography. You've got a camera and you probably noticed a setting called ISO or ISO. You have no idea what that means. It's kind of important. Today, creepy decapitated head lady and me are going to show you. Stick around. Today we're going to talk about ISO. Before we move on, we should mention that that's part of the exposure triangle, which includes shutter speed, f-stops, and ISO. And today we're going to talk about ISO. Okay, if you're my age, you can remember when we used to buy film for our cameras, and even the casual photographer knew that you had 100 ASA and 400 ASA and 800 ASA, and these were used for different settings. You have to get the 100 ASA for bright sun, 400 for like cloudy days, and 800 for inside, and pretty much that's all the casual photographer ever bought. What that means specifically is the sensitivity the film has to light. So you understand that your camera is basically just a light box, and through a variety of mechanisms, it lets in different amounts of light for different purposes. And again, that's that shutter, that's that exposure triangle we talked about. The first thing that's going to let light in is your f-stop or the aperture in your lens. The next thing that's going to let light in is your shutter. And the last thing that lets light in, or that is used to expose your image, is, in the old days, what was film. Now it's a sensor, okay? And we don't call it ASA anymore. There's people that know more about this than I do, but basically it's called ISO. And it's top tip. If you want to be cool, call it ISO, don't call it ISO. It's reasonable to understand that most people call it ISO because we used to call it ASA, and when they changed the standards of the international blah, blah, blah standards, I don't know. So it's right there. Just make it right here. The reason it's they do standards for lots of things other than film. And it was Tony Northrup that I first watched and realized that, in fact, it is called ISO, not ISO. So most cameras have a base ISO of between 50 and 200. And when you're on that base ISO... Stop. You just said to call it ISO, and just now you called it ISO twice. That's when the camera requires more light to take a properly exposed picture. And as you get to the higher ISOs, it requires less light to take a properly exposed picture. Now, just like every other point in the exposure triangle, there's a trade-off. When you are using your base ISO, it does require more light, but usually that picture looks the best because it has the least amount of noise. Contrary to popular belief, you're never not going to have no noise. But you'll have the least noise, and it won't even be noticeable by the human eye. And then when you're using higher ISOs, especially up in the 12,000s or 25,000 range, then you're going to have noticeable noise. And we'll talk about that with her in just a moment. So before we move on, let's talk about a couple of illustrations of what I mean by noise. Okay, so now as we're looking at the pictorial examples of Milady, you can see that we have an ISO of 100, which is the base ISO on my camera. We have an f-stop of 4, which is as wide open as this particular lens can go, which lets in the most light. And we have 1/8 a second shutter speed. So in this example, I'm going to have the shutter speed go faster and faster with each exposure, letting in less light. So to compensate, the ISO will have to get higher or less sensitive. I should say more sensitive. And let's see what happens. So we have ISO 100 at a shutter speed of 1/8 per second. As we go up with a faster shutter speed of 1/30 per second, it's going to have to go to 400, then to 1600 with a shutter speed of 1/125th per second, till we get up 6400 with a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. And finally, the highest ISO my particular camera can go to unenhanced is 12800. And that's at 1/1000th of a second. Now, glancing at this on video, you may not even be able to really tell the difference. But if you click back on the original 100 and then go into the more or less a white area, like the wall behind it, you can see that that is fairly unnoisy. Even if you go in close, it's slightly noisy, but you probably can't even tell on video, and you'd never really be able to see it on print too much. But if you go to ISO 12800, I think you can see even on video that that's remarkably more noisy. Now, like I said, in some situations, that's not really going to matter because you're going to put it on YouTube and people might not even notice. But in a lot of occasions, that really does matter. So that's basically the sacrifice you're making when you push your camera's ISO higher. I should mention at this point, while I have this up on in Lightroom, that with the advent of digital photography, ISO is becoming more arbitrary than it used to be. In the old days with film, if you had ASA 100 and you were in a dark room, there wasn't much you could do with that, because most of us didn't have Lightroom back then, not Lightroom, the software. Most of us didn't have a Lightroom and an enlarger and all the chemicals to do it ourselves. We just took it to the photo shack and they did it. And if it was poorly exposed because we had the wrong ISO film, then our ASA film, then you're out of luck. Today, of course, we now have sensor technology, which is a lot of electronics. In addition, we have software. And we should talk about raw photography. When I mean raw photography, I mean taking your photos on a raw setting rather than a JPEG setting on another occasion. But just let's throw this little caveat in right here. You should always use raw. If you have any expectation of ever going into a post setting like this using Lightroom or Photoshop, because it gives you a lot more data to work with. All right, so anyway, the point I was making is you have the ability to fix some of this in post that you didn't have in days before. If you take this luminance thing and go to noise reduction, you will see as you go up that it takes out, it doesn't really take out, it sort of blends in the noise. So it's not quite so noticeable. Now you can't go crazy with that because it'll mess up your shot. If you go crazy with it, by the way, this is what I see people doing with their filters on their iPhones, is they go crazy with the noise reduction and it just makes everything this weird dull look. Notice how creepy severed head lady has got this more or less weird China doll look, whereas back in here she looked more this may not be apparent on the video, but here you can see she looks more normal. When you do too much noise reduction, it just doesn't make it look real, but you can find a fine balance in there that you could probably work with. This isn't something you want to do generally. I mean, you generally want to be able to get as best in camera as you can, but this is something you can do when you're forced to shoot at high ISOs. Another way to fix high ISOs is a little trick that I see photographers use all the time, is to make it black and white. Because for some reason on black and white, I guess we just expect a little more noise, a little more grain seems acceptable. And also if you punch up the clarity or the contrast on something like that, all of a sudden that noise almost looks artistically intentional. And also it takes out the noise artifacts, because it's not just noise in the contrast of the light and the dark, there's also noise in the light, in the color. And when you make it black and white, that sort of takes that out. And you can see how that sort of makes it, kind of cool. Maybe that's what you can tell your client, well, that's what I meant to do. So you're asking yourself, great, I want to lower the ISO on my shots, but how can I do that with my camera? Well, there's good news. First of all, as part of the, if I can say so for myself, as part of the exposure triangle where you have shutter speed, ISO, and f-stop, ISO is the thing I really pay the less attention to because I don't do a lot of low light photography. And in a lot of situations, you can just keep ISO on automatic. So even if you put your camera in manual mode, where you're controlling the f-stops and you're controlling the shutter speed, you can probably put ISO automatic so that your camera will use the lowest ISO it can use given the situation it's given. And for most of it, that's fine. I know a lot of photographers keep their camera in ISO automatic almost all the time, and that's almost always okay with a few exceptions. Notably, if you're in a studio and you controlling the light of a flash, you don't want any variations. So you put everything in a studio. You'd put your ISOs on its lowest setting because you have control of all the light. You have all the light you need. So why wouldn't you put it on the lowest setting for the best shot? So in a studio, you typically put your ISO in 100. There are some other situations where you just don't want variation, maybe like a time-lapse photography or night photography, where you're going to be, it's going to be dark. And so you're going to want to set your ISOs a little higher. And typically, again, if you're doing anything like stargazing from shot to shot to shot, you want it to be the same. So you never want to put things in auto in that situation because then it'll shift between every shot. Anyway, the basic thing to understand is for your day-to-day photography where you're out doing, portraits or cityscapes or whatever, you can just keep it on automatic. Okay, so how do you change the ISO on your camera to automatic? Well, it so widely varies from camera to camera. I'm not even going to really get into it in this video. For a less expensive camera, you're almost certainly going to have to go into the menu system and find it. You can't just do it on the fly. You're going to have to go in the menu system and change ISO and to whatever you want it to be, automatic, 100, 200, whatever. For a more expensive camera, they have a dedicated dial that just says ISO on you. So that's about it, really. This is Greg Lewis from Orange Frog Photography Frog Blog. Hey, if you have any comments or questions, please go ahead and leave them in the section below. And I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my channel, and also click on the little bell so when I do a new video, you'll be notified. So thanks so much and stay focused.